What's up, everybody? We out here. So tomorrow is November 11th, Remembrance Day. It's a very special day. Anticipation for November 11th, I read this book called Vimy, written by Pierre Burton. The first time that I had read it, Pierre Burton's an amazing author. And in this book, there's, maybe 50 to 100 different accounts from the men who were actually there. So their own written word. And Pierre combines it all together, the history and their own experiences, to have just a very enjoyable read. Took me 5 days. And it's just one of those books that as a Canadian, it really just makes you feel proud. What made me feel so proud about the Canadian experience at Vimy Ridge was people from all over this massive country all combined together in this single force for a specific goal. There was nothing but unity. Now, were they fighting for Canada? No. Were they fighting for England? No. They were fighting for each other. The conditions of World War I, it's just beyond how I could explain it. I couldn't imagine. I would imagine Pierre Burton gets pretty close to it. But, it's just raining all of the time. The trenches generally have 3 to 4 feet of mud in it. Very little food. Bombs all the time. And it's just indiscriminate killing. People dying left, right, and center. You don't really get the opportunity to bury them. So the whole, just horrific experience. And when he's telling the stories of the men who were there, he gives their name, their rank, and it would have been from Mississauga, Charlie from Vancouver, Patrick from Moose Jaw. And it's that type of experience. And buddy, there's a guy named Victor Odlum from Coburg. And you're just reading, you're like, wow, I know all of these cities. And there is something here that just unites us all together. And it's experiences like this that brought us together and brought us together as a nation. So I wanted to talk about it for November 11th, because really that's what we're talking about these days. Maybe there's an identity crisis in Canada. We're not going to get going into that right now. The fact of the matter is, there doesn't need to be an identity crisis, because we read stories like this, and I know exactly where I'm from, and I know exactly what brings me together, and I know exactly what I take pride in, right? I read stories like this, and I do get a lot of pride in it, and no one can take that away from me. And no matter what anybody does to any monument, no matter what anybody does to any historical figure, you can't take away what it is that they've done in books like this. And books like this. There's a lot of history out there. And when you read it, you start to just reflect and appreciate what it is that we have right now, because it's a flicker. It can be taken away from us so quickly. But the fact is, we got here because we fought for it. So we got to keep fighting to keep what we have and to remember. So anyways, Vimy Ridge. I want to just talk about Vimy Ridge. It took place in 1917, April 9th, 1917 at 5:30 a.m. 40,000 Canadians went over the top and changed the course of World War I forever. Now I will note that this is a huge battle in Canadian history, but it's kind of a footnote in a lot of mainstream World War I textbooks, that like American and European ones, But the fact of the matter is, we have an amazing monument over there commemorating what it is the men had done at this battle. So it was a 4-day battle, essentially. Most of the objectives got done and completed in 6 hours. It took 4 months worth of planning. Much of the planning was inspired by the massacre at the Somme, of which Canada participated in. So the Battle of the Somme happened July 1st, 1916. 20,000 Brits died on the first day. And by and large, that happened because when they got to the other side, ran across no man's land, the barbed wire hadn't been blown up. So barbed wire was generally 20 feet high, it could be, right? It was just mounds and mounds of barbed wire. How are you going to get over it? So you got to blow through it, and then you can advance forward. But at the Somme, that didn't happen. Poor planning. So Julian Byng took note of that. Now, Julian Byng was our general at the time. So we have 4 divisions, 40,000 men approximately. Our head guy is Julian Byng, and each division has its own commander. And the commander of the first division was Arthur Currie, who eventually took over for Julian Byng. Arthur Currie is an amazing man, Canadian hero, the greatest general in Canadian history. And this Battle of Vimy Ridge, there are so many iconic characters that participated in this battle, survived, came back to Canada and did great things, or continued on in the war and did great things. So there's a lot of names that participated in this battle. So where Vimy is in France. So if you see that little arrow there, that's where it is. It's right close to Belgium. So that's where Vimy is, and you can see Paris just down there. Vimy's up here. So Canada said, we want Vimy. The Brits tried to take it, they failed. The French tried to take it, they failed. The Canadians post up and said, we're going to do this. So they roll in December of 1916, and they start planning. And they say, we don't want another Somme. How are we going to get from one end to the other and take this frickin' ridge? So this is the map that I drew, and it's from this book here. All of these blue little lines here, these are actual subways that are around 50 feet under the ground that were left from the French and the English. So these were vital to the element of surprise, and that's what they wanted to do. There was very many keys to victory in this, and it required a lot of strategy. One of them was surprise. We needed to catch the Germans by surprise. So this would allow us to accomplish that. So a lot of our troops on the day of the battle were hiding in here. A lot of our reserve troops were hiding in here, or a lot of our cannons were hiding in here as we were bringing all the cannons up. There was 983 cannons at this battle. And leading into the battle, they had been firing machine gun bullets and firing at the German lines for about 10 to 15 days straight. Like over 500 shells were fired from each cannon each day. It was the greatest military barrage up until that point in history. So, and there's a lot that goes into that. And as a matter of fact, the man who designed what's called the creeping barrage. So I'll get to this. So here we are. This is the Canadian trench, right? And this brown dotted line is the German trench. Generally, they were no more than a football field apart. A lot of times closer, 35 yards. Sometimes up here, actually, it was a pretty big jaunt. No, down here, it was a pretty big jaunt. This is where the 4th Division was. Pretty big jaunt, like many, many yards. But around here, it was real tight. So, I mean, he's saying you could just throw a football to the other side, right? So this is what you got to deal with. So this is Hill 145, the highest part of the entire ridge. So the ridge is over here, but if you look at it from this way, they say it's kind of looked like a humpback whale. So it's kind of behind the German trench there, and they call this the pimple because it looked like the little the blowhole from the whale. So it's real high ground here. Hill 145, that's where the monument was built. The Vimy Monument is on Hill 145. This was a pain in the ass to take. This was a bigger pain in the ass to take, the pimple. So the whole plan here was in a matter of like 6 to 8 hours, we were just going to blow through these guys. So a lot of planning had went into this. As a matter of fact, the Canadians had a terrible reputation leading up until this battle as far as I'm concerned. I mean, they did perform well at the Battle of Ypres. They got a lot of respect there because they got gassed, yet they continued forward. That was in 1916. But leading up until this battle and leading up until the Battle of Ypres, Canada was poorly outfitted. They were barely trained. They had very little combat experience. And I mean, the country was just composed from all over the country. Just, you had French, you had Newfoundlanders, it was just disaster. So he talks about the preparation that went into World War I from a Canadian perspective. I mean, men had just volunteered and they had no training. Before they knew it, they were in Europe. That being said, most of these guys were only teenagers, okay? 16, 17, 18. I read an account in here of a 13-year-old at this battle. So again, 4 divisions. How are we going to get this done? The biggest barrage in Canadian in military history up until this point. 983 guns in 3 rows, basically firing for 10, 15 days. They were going to soften up this whole area. It was designed by this man named Andrew McNaughton. You may know him because he was the general of Canada in World War II, the first commander. So they were going to do what's called a creeping barrage. So they were going to pound the crap out of this, and then on April 9th, when all the guys went over the top, all of the guys were going to walk across no man's land as the barrage softened up the Germans. So before you knew it, the Canadians would be on top of them. But in this day and age, communication was vital. So each division had different colored armbands, and they had planes going over the top so that they could identify the guys with the armbands and how far across they were across the field, so that they could report back to McNaughton to keep moving the barrage forward. So as a matter of fact, when the guys were going across no man's land and taking objectives, they had men behind them with telephone wire, laying wire behind them, so they could call back. Communication was huge, and they had the planes going over top. Billy Bishop was there, Canada's greatest ace. He participated in this battle, reconnaissance. So you had 4 divisions going across. The first division was your boy, Arthur Currie, doing his thing. Pursued this way. Second division doing their thing. Third division. This was all pretty easy. The guys moving across was all pretty easy. Now the thing was, what made it easy was because the Canadians were the first country to do trench raiding. It was invented by this guy named Victor Odlum from Cobourg, Ontario. Basically, they got into parties of 80 to 100 guys, sometimes 20 to 30. And at night, they would go over there with what's called a Lewis machine gun and a Mills bomb, which is like an egg, but had a lot of shrapnel in it. It was a damaging grenade. That's by and large what they used. And that's how they did the trench raiding. But while they were going across and doing the trench raiding, they were surveying the land. And they were taking prisoners. For 4 months they did this. Brought prisoners back from each sector. Mapped out all of the land. This whole no man's land was just craters of body parts and barbed wire and carnage. Absolute carnage. And it's described in such vivid, dramatic form in this book. But they surveyed it all. Some of these craters were 40, 50 feet deep. Just massive, because there was mines in the ground that got blown up. And there was just blood and mud and guts all in there, so you needed to avoid it. So they mapped it all out. And each platoon had its own objective. So the Canadian force was all unified. They actually had, after they got enough intel, back here they created sort of like a replica of the German trench system so they could practice. They practice it ad nauseum. So Julian Byng and Arthur Currie, when they were walking around amongst their troops, they would just quiz guys randomly on what's your objective. And if they failed, then they would discipline the commander of that platoon. So what allowed us to get this victory was the creeping barrage, was communication. Also, it was the trench raiding to get the intel. And it was good old Canadian ingenuity. So they built SAPs. So in the middle here, not only do you have these subways, but then they built these little SAPs that went into no man's land. And they were about three foot high, 3 foot wide little tunnels for men to crawl through. And for 4 months, they secretly created those sapping tunnels. Now, while they're creating these, the Germans were doing the same thing. So they're in these little tunnels and they're trying to listen over to what the Germans are doing, but sometimes the Germans would know. And then they would just blow that hole up and the guy would never be found again. So when they created these SAPs all going into no man's land, on the eve of the battle, they had a whole bunch, they had the first line of attack was all positioned pretty much in the middle of the field. So that when it was finally time to go, they had all of these guys in the middle of the field and they would move forward. And it was just devastation, absolute devastation. And then when these guys in the middle conquered the first trench, then all of these guys came up and they moved forward. There was 3 trenches here, 3 German trenches. So the Canadians made quick work up here, and there's a lot of good stories there about each individual division, and maybe that's something I'll just read. So Canada won this battle. We got some exact numbers. 3,598 Canadians died in the 4 days. This was all taken in hours. This was the bastard that took at least 2 days. And the British were flanking on each side. So when you're looking at this and you're talking about all of the Canadians that participated in this, they were from all over the country. And it was a great unifying experience. And the stories of them it's just amazing. So that's the lay of the land. I don't want to bore you too much longer, but tomorrow, November 11th, just remember things like this. And if you get a chance, maybe read a war story or two. And, what those men experience is just absolute carnage. And it doesn't even need to be from the Canadian perspective. It just needs to be from your relative's perspective, I think. I think Remembrance Day is just you remembering anybody who you know that put their life on the line for a greater cause, which I think is the ultimate sacrifice. And World War I was an absolute bloodbath, basically over nothing, right? Well, I couldn't say nothing, but there's a lot of theory that goes into it that's interesting, and I could actually speak on that theory. But that being said, we'll end that for now. Go Canada, go. Remember,